On June 17, 2026, the United States and Iran signed a document that both governments needed badly enough to overlook what it actually said. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding was 14 points long, negotiated through Pakistani and Qatari mediation after weeks of stalled talks, and it did what both sides wanted on paper. It ended active strikes, began unwinding the American naval blockade, and set a 60-day clock for negotiating a permanent settlement covering sanctions and Iran's nuclear program. Buried inside it, as Clause 5, was a single sentence that would determine whether that ceasefire survived contact with reality. Upon the signing of this MOU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge, for 60 days only, from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman, and vice versa. The clause continues, specifying that Iran alone would handle demining the strait within 30 days, and that Iran, not the United States, not the United Nations, not a joint international body, would conduct dialogue with Oman to define the strait's future administration. Read that clause slowly, because 10 days after it was signed, it became the fault line the entire ceasefire broke along. The language doesn't describe a shared arrangement. It assigns Iran the administrative responsibility for deciding how ships move through one of the most valuable waterways on Earth, and it names Oman, not Washington, as Iran's designated partner for figuring out what happens after the 60-day window closes. The United States signed that text. Whatever the strategic reasoning behind it, the document on paper hands Tehran a role in Hormuz governance that goes well beyond simply not shooting at tankers. The clause was tested almost immediately. On June 25th, a Singapore-flagged container ship, the Ever Lovely, was struck by a drone while transiting what Iran considered an unauthorized southern corridor, a route the International Maritime Organization had been using as part of an evacuation plan for vessels and crew stranded in the Gulf. CENTCOM struck Iranian targets in response the next day, calling it a powerful response to what it termed a foolish ceasefire violation. Then, at 4:30 in the morning Eastern Time on June 27th, a one-way attack drone hit the Panama-flagged tanker MT Kiku as it carried more than 2 million barrels of crude oil near the strait. CENTCOM responded within hours, striking 10 Iranian military targets, surveillance infrastructure, communication systems, air defense sites, drone storage facilities, and mine-laying capability. Iran's Revolutionary Guard retaliated with drone and missile strikes against U.S.-linked facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait. Bahrain's government confirmed it had been targeted and called the attack a violation of its sovereignty. It was the second consecutive night of strikes, and it cracked a ceasefire that was barely 10 days old. The two governments now dispute what actually happened, and the dispute isn't really about the facts of the Kiku strike. Both sides agree Iran hit the ship. It's about which corridor the Kiku was using and who had the authority to designate it in the first place. The United States, through the Navy's Joint Maritime Information Center, had been working to establish and widen transit corridors, including a southern route along the Omani coast, to keep commercial traffic moving during the ceasefire. Iran's position, stated repeatedly by its officials, was that Clause 5 gave Tehran the administrative authority to determine safe routes, and that any corridor established without Iran's coordination wasn't legitimate, regardless of American intentions. Iran's foreign ministry said explicitly that the strait remained under Iran's oversight and management, and that unilateral action by any party would only worsen the situation. From Washington's side, the argument runs differently. Clause 5 obligated Iran to ensure passage was safe, full stop, and a tanker getting hit by an Iranian drone is definitionally a failure of that obligation, regardless of which lane it was sailing in. Both readings have some textual support. That's exactly the problem. An ambiguity this consequential, sitting inside a single sentence, was never resolved before ships started using the routes it was supposed to govern. The practical cost of that ambiguity showed up immediately in shipping data. Traffic through the strait, which had been running at something close to normal volume in the days after the ceasefire took hold, dropped sharply as Iran's warnings about unauthorized corridors escalated and vessels started avoiding the strait altogether, rather than risk being caught in the interpretive gap. The Joint Maritime Information Center raised its threat assessment from moderate to substantial within days of the Kiku strike, a formal acknowledgement that the safe passage guarantee at the center of Clause 5 was no longer holding in practice, whatever the legal argument about who was responsible for that failure. It's worth taking seriously why the United States would sign language this favorable to Iran's position in the first place, because the answer says something about the state of the war in mid-June. By the time the Islamabad talks concluded, the United States and Israel had struck thousands of targets across Iran since the campaign began in late February, degraded much of Iran's air defense network, and killed senior Iranian officials, including, in the war's opening days, the supreme leader himself. But Iran's government hadn't collapsed, and the war was generating serious costs on the American side that had nothing to do with the battlefield. The Senate had passed a war powers resolution aimed at constraining the president's authority to continue the campaign without congressional authorization. Gulf allies hosting American forces, the same countries the United States needed for basing and overflight rights, had absorbed real damage from Iranian missile and drone retaliation throughout the war. Oil markets were unsettled, and the economic strain of an open-ended Gulf conflict was becoming a harder sell domestically the longer it continued without a clear resolution. Islamabad wasn't signed from a position where Washington had no leverage. It was signed because ending an increasingly costly war, even on terms that left Iran with real administrative standing over Hormuz, had become more attractive than continuing to fight for terms that gave Iran nothing. That trade-off helps explain why the ceasefire cracked as fast as it did. A deal built to buy time rather than resolve the underlying dispute over who controls the strait was always going to face its real test the first time a ship got hit, because at that point, both governments had to decide whether the agreement's ambiguity would be resolved through negotiation, which the memorandum's own text implies, or through the kind of immediate military response that both sides had spent the previous 4 months treating as the default reaction to any provocation. The United States chose the latter, twice, within 24 hours, before any negotiation over the disputed corridor had taken place. There's a second story running underneath the Article 5 dispute, and it concerns an ally who wasn't in the room when any of this got negotiated. Israel fought alongside the United States for the length of this campaign, and Israeli officials have been notably blunt in expressing frustration with the shape of the eventual settlement. Israel's defense minister said publicly that Israeli forces would not withdraw from their security zone in southern Lebanon even if the American president asked, a direct signal of daylight between Jerusalem's position and whatever Washington was negotiating. The Islamabad memorandum itself, notably, was negotiated primarily through Pakistani and Qatari mediation, two governments with limited or no formal diplomatic relationship with Israel, and Israel was not a party to the memorandum's text. For a government that fought this war as America's closest regional partner, watching the terms of the ceasefire get set by other hands is a meaningful thing to sit with, regardless of what any public statement from either government says about alliance solidarity. That tension matters beyond the optics of who signed what. Throughout this war, one read of American and Israeli strategy has been that a sufficiently degraded Iran would leave Israel as the unambiguous dominant power in the region, with whatever remained of Iran's proxy network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, too weakened to constrain Israeli freedom of action. Whatever the accuracy of that framing, it's clear that outcome hasn't arrived. Iran's government held together through 5 months of sustained strikes. Its negotiators secured language in the ceasefire's core text that gives Tehran real administrative standing over the region's most valuable choke point. And the agreement that produced that outcome was negotiated without Israel at the table. If the strategic logic of this war, from Israel's perspective, depended on Iran emerging from it broken and sidelined, the Islamabad memorandum, Clause 5 specifically, is hard to square with that outcome. An Iran with textual negotiated authority over Hormuz shipping is not an Iran that has been removed as a regional counterweight. It's an Iran that has converted battlefield losses into a durable diplomatic asset. None of this proves the United States or Israel miscalculated from the start, and it's worth being fair to the alternative reading. Ending a war that was generating real domestic political costs, real strain on Gulf allies, and real economic disruption was not, on its own, a bad decision. A responsible government facing diminishing returns from continued escalation has legitimate reasons to seek an off-ramp, even an imperfect one. And the Islamabad memorandum did produce real, verifiable outcomes beyond Clause 5. An end to the naval blockade, a framework for economic reconstruction, and a formal 60-day window for negotiating the harder issues, the nuclear program, sanctions, long-term security arrangements, that the war was actually fought over. A ceasefire that buys time to negotiate those larger questions, even one with an ambiguous shipping clause, is not obviously worse than continuing an open-ended air campaign with no clearer endpoint. What that argument has to explain, though, is the sequence that followed. If Washington intended Clause 5's ambiguity to be worked out through the dialogue the text itself calls for, Iran coordinating with Oman, disputes resolved through the 60-day negotiating process, then the immediate resort to airstrikes after the first contested incident represents a significant deviation from the deal's own stated mechanism for resolving exactly this kind of disagreement. And it has to explain why the United States, having signed language assigning Iran administrative responsibility for the strait, simultaneously worked to establish its own transit corridors without securing Iran's coordination first, a move that all but guaranteed a collision between the text Washington signed and the operations Washington was running in practice. A ceasefire's credibility depends on both sides treating its ambiguities as things to be negotiated rather than unilaterally resolved by whichever party is willing to escalate first. By the last week of June, both governments had demonstrated they were prepared to do the latter. Where this leaves the broader picture is genuinely unsettled, and it's worth resisting the temptation to declare a clean winner. What's verifiable is this. The United States signed a document assigning Iran real administrative standing over the Strait of Hormuz's future governance. That standing got tested within 10 days, produced a shooting exchange, and left the ceasefire's central safe passage guarantee functioning in name only within the first month. An ally that fought this war at America's side watched the settlement get negotiated by other governments over a choke point whose administration Israel has no formal say in. And a strait that both economies and militaries depend on remains governed by a sentence, Clause 5, whose two most plausible readings point toward fundamentally different futures. One where Iran administers a fifth of the world's oil transit as a matter of settled international practice, and one where the United States never actually intended to honor that reading and is negotiating, however roughly, toward reclaiming ground the text itself already gave away. Which reading prevails will likely be decided less by legal argument than by what happens the next time a ship gets hit, and which side is still willing to escalate first when it does.